Hey everyone, this is a piece by the KAPD titled The Russian Tragedy. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for the KAPD before I read this. So here we go. The Communist Workers' Party of Germany was an anti-parliamentarian and left communist party that was active in Germany during the Weimar Republic. It was founded in 1920 in Heidelberg as a split from the Communist Party of Germany, KPD. Originally, the party remained a sympathizing member of the Communist International. In 1922, the KAPD split into two factions, both of whom kept the name, but are referred to as the KAPD Essen faction and the KAPD Berlin faction. The KAPD Essen faction was linked to the Communist Workers' International. The Entschiedene Linke joined the KAPD in 1927, and just real quick, the Entschiedene Linke, determined left, was communist political current formed by Karl Korsch and Ernst Schwarz in 1926. It initially attracted around 7,000 members. The political positions were in all important issues identical to those of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, and during their Congress from the 4th to the 6th, they decided unanimously to join them. The roots of the KAPD lie in the left-wing split from the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, calling itself the International Socialists of Germany. The International Socialists of Germany consisted of elements which were to the left of the Spartacus League of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The Spartacists and the ISD entered the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, USPD, the centrist splinter of the SPD, in 1915 as an autonomous tendency within the party. The left wing of the USPD consisted of Spartacists and ultra-left council communists, went on to form the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, in 1918. In 1920, the ultra-lefts of this party, mainly consisting of council communist members whose origins lay in the International Socialists of Germany, split from it to form the KAPD. I'd be cautious about saying council communism at this point. I don't know if council communism becomes a distinct tendency until a little later, but let's just roll with it. Founding Conference 4th to 5th of April 1920, Berlin. The KAPD was formed on the 4th of April 1920 by members of the left wing of the KPD who had been excluded at the Heidelberg Party Conference of the KPD from the 20th to the 23rd of October 1919 by the central leadership under Paul Levy. Their main goal was an immediate abolition of bourgeois democracy and the construction of the constitution of a dictatorship of the proletariat, or they decided against a one-party dictatorship in the Russian model. The KAPD especially rejected the Leninist form of organization along with democratic centralism, participation in elections, and activism within reformist trade unions, unlike the KPD. The Dutch communist theoreticians Anton Pannekoek and Herman Gorter played an important role in the KAPD. They had, on the model of the KAPD, formed the Communist Workers' Party of the Netherlands, KAPN, which, however, never attained a similar status to that of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany. The conference was attended by 11 delegates from Berlin, with 24 from further afield, who together represented about 38,000 members. The origins of the KAPD's establishment lay in the Kapp Putsch. In the view of the KPD's left wing, this event had shown that the behavior of the KPD party leadership was synonymous with giving up the revolutionary fight, as the KPD's position on the general strike had changed several times, and in the Bielefeld Agreement of the 24th of March 1920, the KPD had consented to the disarmament of the Ruhr Red Army. The Berlin District Group on the 3rd of April 1920 called a Congress of the left wing. There it was decided to form the Communist Workers' Party of Germany. The delegates, according to estimates, represented 80,000 KPD members. The newly formed party advocated the ending of parliamentary activities and the active fight against the bourgeois state. In the coming period, it worked closely with the General Workers' Union of Germany, AAUD. The main bastions of the party were in Berlin, Hamburg, Bremen, and East Saxony, all places in which a large part of KPD members switched allegiance to the new party. First Ordinary Party Congress, 1st to the 4th of August 1920. The Congress was held in the Zum Pro-Latin Restaurant, Berlin. In August 1920, the founding members of the Hamburg branch were expelled. Heinrich Laufenberg and Fritz Wolfheim, who had advocated national Bolshevist ideas. 2 months later, another founding member, Otto Rühle, was expelled. Citation needed, end bracket. From 1920 to 1921, the KAPD was a co-opted member of the Third International. Sorry, I don't know why I said it that weird. In 1920, the KAPD cooperated again with the KPD during the March Action. This was triggered by Weimar Republic troops marching into the industrial region of central Germany, and the KAPD and KPDs feared that the military intended to occupy the factories. In 1921, a further fragmentation occurred when parts of the AAUD around Rühle, Franz Pfemfert, and Oskar Kennel broke off from the KAPD and formed the AAUE. After 1921, when the KAPD still had over 43,000 members, the party's influence declined more and more, and it separated in 1922 into the Berlin tendency and the Essen tendency around Alexander Schwab, Arthur Goldstein, Bernhard Reichenbach, and Karl Schroeder. The main reason was the Essen faction's rejection of participation in worker struggles in factories in a situation seen as revolutionary. The Essen tendency founded the Communist Workers' International, but dissolved in 1927. The Berlin tendency was the larger and more enduring group, surviving until 1933 when it merged into the Communist Workers' Union. Affiliated unions. The AAUD was formed to combine factory organizations in opposition to the traditional trade unions and was affiliated with the KAPD. The German leftists who formed the AAUD considered organizing based on trades as being an outmoded form of organization and instead advocated organizing workers based on factories, thus forming the AAUD. KAPD leaders also considered the AAUD appropriate because it broke from the older, less revolutionary workers' organizations. The factory organizations in the AAUD were the basis for organizing workers' councils. A section led by Otto Rühle, based in Essen, split from the AAUD, forming the General Workers' Union of Germany Unitary Organization, AAUDE. Kommunistische Arbeiterjugend. The youth wing of the party was the Kommunistische Arbeiterjugend, KAJ, or Communist Workers' Youth. They published a, quote, struggle organ, Rote Jugend, or Red Youth. Relations with the Comintern. The delegates of the KAPD to the Second World Congress of the Comintern were scorned, and their speeches were restricted to a mere 10 minutes. This was following the publication of Lenin's Left-Wing Communism, which was written as a critique of the left-wing ideas of the KAPD, among other left communist parties, including the KAPN. The theses on the role of the Communist Party in the proletarian revolution, adopted by the Second World Congress, also explicitly criticized the KAPD for their position about the role of the Communist Party. Following the exclusionary attitude shown towards the KAPD in the Comintern, the KAPD broke with the International in 1921. Historian E.H. Kars argued that the Second World Congress, to some extent unintentionally and unconsciously, was the first to, quote, establish Russian leadership of the Comintern on an impregnable basis, end quote. E.H. Carr. Relations with the Italian communist left. The German left communist opposition is sometimes confused with the Italian communist left, or, quote, Sinistra Comunista, which formed the Communist Workers' Party of Italy, and is today represented by the International Communist Party, among others. While both opposed the Comintern, these two lefts had fundamental political differences: the role of the party, trade unions, class organizations and parties, anti-parliamentarism in principle, and others. Sinistra held same criticism towards the KAPD as the Comintern on the Second World Congress, and these differences were not mended even as the Comintern grew increasingly distant from them both. Amadeo Bordiga, leader of the Sinistra in that time, who met members of KAPD in person in Berlin on his route to Moscow, in a 1926 letter to Karl Korsch, was skeptical of any joint action between the two lefts because of the fundamental political divergences, and stated, quote, "We agree with Lenin's theses, bracket, on the party's role, end bracket, at the Second Congress," end quote. Amadeo Bordiga. The party published a paper, Kommunistische Arbeiterzeitung. It also published a monthly theoretical magazine, Der Proletarier, between 1920 and 1927. And then there's a list of prominent members of the KAPD: Jan Appel, Adolf Dettmann, Arthur Goldstein, Hermann Gorder, Anton Pannekoek, Franz Jung, Karl Korsch, Heinrich Laufenberg, Paul Maddock, Franz Femfert, Bernhard Reichenbach, Otto Rühle, Adam Scharrer, Karl Schröder, Ernst Schwarz, Fritz Wolfheim. On the list of works from the KAPD that are on Marxist.org include 1920 Program of the KPD, 1920 Appeal to the Proletariat of Germany, 1921 KAPD Report on the Third Congress of the Comintern, 1921 Jan Appel Speech at the Third Congress of the Communist International, 1969 Bernhard Reichenbach The KAPD in Retrospect, 1971 Jacques Camat The KAPD and the Proletarian Movement, 1976, Gilles Devey and Denis Autier, The KAPD and the AAUDE from the Communist Left in Germany, 1918 to 1921. Okay. All right, so here we go. KAPD, the Russian Tragedy. This is from 1927 again. In a few months, the 10th anniversary of the stormy and glorious days of the Russian October Revolution of 1917 will be here. The victory of the Russian industrial proletarians and poor peasants over their oppressors, the capitalists and large-scale agrarians, made the hearts of all class-conscious workers throughout the capitalist world beat faster with joy and enthusiasm. It became a great source of moral light and strength for the world proletariat, which had just been afflicted by the treacherous social betrayal of the Second International. The October victory of the Russian workers threatened to become the igniting spark of the proletarian world revolution, and therefore instilled paralyzing fear, terror, horror, and impotent rage in the capitalists of all countries. The situation is different, quite different, in the 10th year after the Russian October. The international bourgeoisie has long since breathed a sigh of relief and is presenting the public with fewer and fewer reports of horrors about, quote, the land of the Bolshevik reign of terror, end quote, because the heroic era of the Russian Revolution is over, and the proletarians, the majority of them, believe that Russia is still an outpost of the world revolution. They believe this because it is still the Bolshevik Party with its revolutionary credit that holds the Russian government tax in its hands. But this belief, however strong its roots in the minds of the working masses, has no material basis. It is being shaken to its foundations by the real social forces, by the class relations that the domestic politics of Russia determine. What are these Russian class relations? According to Stalin's figures, On the 1st of October 1925, there were approximately 7 million wage workers, of which 1,200,000 were agricultural workers and 715,000 were unemployed, according to the quote, Trude, end quote, of December 12, 1926, there are already 1,023,000 unemployed, exclamation point. The rest, the large remainder of Russia's approximately 130 million strong population, is made up of peasants, the urban bourgeoisie, and the private and state capitalist elements that developed with the introduction of the, quote, new economic policy. The peasants are the overwhelming majority, roughly 80% of the total population, and are divided, according to Zinoviev, into 45% poor peasants, 50% middle peasants, and 5% kulaki, large peasants. Again, I don't know if I said this already, but I'm translating. I'm using Google Translate, and this is a document that's in German, so some of the text might not be perfect. The Bolsheviks recognized very well in 1917 that this social composition, the peasants outnumbering the proletarians by at least 8 times, was decisive for Russian state policy. Only with the slogan, "Land for the Peasants," were the Bolsheviks able to win their victory over Kerensky and create the armies necessary to ward off the White Guard's onslaught. But none of the Russian Bolsheviks recognized earlier than Lenin that the Russian peasant masses were simultaneously being pushed into developing into a socially independent class by breaking their czar's feudalistic shackles. As early as 1919, Lenin called out to the Eighth Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, quote, "Don't command the peasants," end quote. Lenin was thus reminding his triumphant comrades of the Marxist truism that the class relations of a country are decisive for the direction of its state policy, and that, as a result, the Bolsheviks can only assert themselves as a government party. When they respect the will of the Russian peasants, those core troops were placed on the social stage as a consciously active factor by the October Revolution. Quote, "Do not command the peasants," end quote, is the historical warning for the Russian Bolsheviks, not because a proletarian minority could not exercise revolutionary dictatorship over a propertyless peasant majority, but because Russian class relations are only the concrete expression of very specific production relations. And what do these consist of in the vast agricultural areas of Russia? They are characterized by the fact that the former Russian feudal property was not transformed into proletarian common property, but was simply divided into countless pieces. This economic situation was bound to give rise to enormous social difficulties for the Russian October Revolution sooner or later, despite all the political triumphs that the Bolsheviks won over the white gangs during the period of war communism. This criticism is something that's precisely the criticism that's launched by Rosa Luxemburg on the land question in her piece, The Russian Revolution. The crisis, the driving force of which lies primarily in the inadequately developed material conditions of existence in Russia, could only be prevented from breaking out at the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution's socialist tasks were put on an international combat basis as quickly as possible. However, this attempt failed due to the revolutionary weakness of the international and especially the German proletariat, and the crisis was inevitable. When it became obvious in the summer of 1921 that the snail's pace of the world revolution could not be mechanically transformed into express train speed, the Russian Bolsheviks were faced with the unavoidable alternative: either to perish politically honorably, if necessary, in the revolutionary struggle against the overwhelming capitalist grip and the unfavorable historical situation in their own country, or to lead a shameful life of illusion and deception at the mercy and compassion of the capitalist powers; either to save the honor of international socialism at the last minute, or to incur the shame of moral ruin by fleeing into an opportunistic policy that is alien to the interests of the proletarian class. In this historical dilemma, the Bolsheviks, in order to formally remain in government, decided on a shameful compromise and thereby betrayed the class content of the Russian proletarian uprising. For the liquidation of the war communist system through the introduction of the new economic policy, the NEP, meant nothing other than a fundamental departure from the methods and goals of proletarian class politics. Even Lenin, in contrast to his Stalinist followers, was fully aware of the anti-proletarian character of the NEP. He said at the time, quote, "The political situation in the spring of 1921 shows us that it is inevitable that we will retreat into the position of state capitalism on a number of economic issues," end quote. Lenin. Elsewhere in the same article, Lenin is even clearer, quote, "The task of the transition to the NEP is precisely that. After attempts at direct socialist construction under the most difficult conditions, we are faced with a clear situation: no direct socialist construction, but a retreat to state capitalism in a whole series of economic areas," end quote. Lenin, quote, "What is that?" end quote. Lenin asks further and answers clearly, quote, "A merger of small-scale production, capital combines small-scale production, capital grows out of small-scale production. We must not close our eyes to this. Of course, freedom of trade means the growth of capitalism. If small-scale production exists, if freedom of exchange exists, then capitalism arises," end quote. Lenin. And in the last speech, which Lenin was able to deliver before his death at a Russian Party Congress, Lenin declared once again, warning against a fundamental error, quote, ... "We do not yet have a socialist foundation. Those communists who imagine the opposite are making a great mistake," end quote. Lenin. The fact that millions of Russian peasants, i.e. the 50% of middle peasants, are landowners and thus private property owners, has increasingly left its mark on Bolshevik state policy, since the economic power of the owning peasant class also has political implications. While in the period of war communism, the specific weight of the middle peasantry was so low that the Bolsheviks could content themselves with the slogan, quote, "neutralization of the middle peasants," end quote. The middle peasant has been so economically strengthened by the NEP that the middle peasant now represents the, quote, "central figure," end quote. Quote, "The middle peasantry is the basic mass, the fundamental layer of the population in the flat countryside. The middle farms form the basic mass of the peasant farms," end quote. I don't know who that quote is from. "The middle peasant forms the majority of the population in the countryside and is therefore the central figure," end quote. I guess there's supposed to be another quotation mark there. It says, stated Bukharin at the 14th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And because the middle peasants are today the most economically powerful class in Russia, they are increasingly dictating the course of domestic policy. This is why the Bolsheviks had to issue the slogan, quote, "alliance of the workers with the middle peasants," end quote. From year to year, it became clearer that the Bolsheviks have been put into an absolute dilemma by the NEP, where they have to present the interests of a class that is alien to the Russian working class. Of course, it would be foolish to deny the possibility of an alliance between industrial workers and peasants. But from a Marxist point of view, it is a fatal self-deception to believe that the most elementary conditions for such an alliance already exist in today's Russia. For the Russian peasant masses, i.e. their decisive middle classes, alongside the kulaki, have been destroyed by the fall of the feudalism that has made them landowners, private owners, ! And as such, their social interests are diametrically opposed to the proletarian class interest. In other words, private ownership of land and property naturally requires agriculture on a capitalist basis, production for the purchasing power of the market, i.e. a commodity economy, while the class goal of the proletariat, including in Russia, ! can only be a needs-based economy, communism, the abolition of bourgeois property. The NEP itself is the most striking proof that the Bolsheviks as a government party can no longer pursue proletarian class politics, since the state policy of every country is determined by its real economic forces. All the well-known concessions of recent years, the reintroduction of free trade, the legal recognition of land leases and the expansion of wage slavery in agriculture, the abolition of the regulations restricting wage labor in home industry, the state support for the accumulation of private capital in the countryside, etc., only confirm how the Bolsheviks are compelled by the social weight of the landowning peasant classes to abandon the interests of the working class bit by bit. Under the pressure of the NEP, capitalist development, the Russian Bolsheviks, as state political representatives of the middle peasant class, must more and more openly dismiss the proletariat with phrases and promises, with the assurance that the vital interests of the peasantry that owns property and is therefore alien to it are its own class interests. At the behest of the government Bolsheviks, the Russian workers are no longer allowed to pursue an independent class policy, but are condemned to renounce the fight for their own interests by forming an alliance with middle peasants who operate on a capitalist basis. The Russian proletarians are forbidden by the quote, Soviet government to fight for communism together with the rural poor, parenthesis, whose numbers are constantly growing due to the agrarian concentration process, in parenthesis, because such a policy would unleash struggle in the countryside. Class struggle between the propertyless and the property owning means disruption, undermining of the NEP economy. The end result is an upheaval of the existing Russian social conditions, a new revolutionary upheaval that is not in the class interests of the economically dominant middle peasants. And that is why the Bolsheviks dictate to the Russian proletariat a truce with the capitalist-oriented peasant masses. This truce, this betrayal of their class interests, which they have to carry out with their own hands, is made palatable to the Russian workers with the assurance, quote, despite the NEP, socialist construction is taking place in Russia because the proletariat has state industry in its hands, end quote. This is the greatest, but at the same time the most worthless trump card that the Bolsheviks can play. For quite apart from the fact that under the current conditions of highly developed world capitalism, socialism in a single country, parenthesis, and in a backward agrarian state at that, in parenthesis, must remain a utopia, and that socialist industry and NEP capitalist agricultural production cannot possibly form an economic unit. The hard facts themselves tell a fundamentally different story from the Leninist explanations. How is it possible, for example, that in Russia, despite the greatest hunger for goods, the million unemployed proletarians simply cannot be given work? Well, just for this reason, Russian industry is not produced for the needs of the masses, but for the purchasing power of the market. The proletariat simply does not have the means of production, otherwise it could use this economic weapon to counter the danger of unemployment from the outset. Russian workers have no decisive influence on the industrial production process. Russian workers are wage slaves who have to sell their labor power as a have to sell their labor. Labor, it doesn't say labor power, it says labor, as a commodity by the piece or by the hour. And their labor is subject to the laws of capitalist market conditions, is attracted to industry when demand for goods increases, and is repelled when the goods do not find sufficient sales due to a lack of purchasing power. The unemployment that the government Bolsheviks cannot eliminate proves clearly enough that Russia has a capitalist production basis, even in state industry, and there can therefore be absolutely no talk of socialist development. A further aggravating factor is the lack of capital and other economic difficulties in Russia, parenthesis, which impair its competitiveness on the world market, end parenthesis, also make the rationalization of the Russian economy necessary, which, as in Germany and all capitalist states, is also taking place at the expense of the workers. On the 17th of October 1926, the quote, Red Flag wrote about this Russian rationalization called the quote, frugality regime, end quote. I think that's it says, quote, the red flag, but I think it's referring to, it's usually when you're reading it English, they say the name in German, but that's the Rote Fahne, which is the newspaper of the Communist Party of Germany. So, on October 17th, 1926, the Rote Fahne wrote about this Russian rationalization called the, quote, frugality regime, end quote. Quote, the process of simple reconstruction by using the old production apparatus is over. Any further development of industrial production is only possible by investing new capital, and to a certain extent by making better use of the existing capital. The possibility of the second type consists primarily in the rationalization of the production process, end quote. In Germany, that means that the social effects of rationalization in Russia also have a tendency to impoverish the masses. The proletariats who burden the production apparatus as superfluous gluttons are thrown out onto the pavement, and, in addition, working conditions are made worse in order to make better use of existing capital and to invest new capital, end quote. It goes without saying that private capital in Russia, the foreign concessionaires, are at the forefront of this rationalization offensive that is systematically depressing the proletarian standard of living. The further the NEP capitalist development of Russia progresses, the sharper the social contradictions between the proletariat and the propertied classes must become. The social perspective of the NEP can already be clearly seen in the Marxist mirror today, and gives the following picture. Here, an increase in agricultural production and growth of peasant wealth. There, an increase in rural poverty due to the increase in the number of small farmers expropriated by the kulaks. Here, growing competitiveness of industry due to progressive rationalization. There, the formation of an army of permanently unemployed and a deterioration of the proletarian class situation. Here, the gluttonous lifestyle of the NEP bourgeoisie. There, the unheard of misery of the proletarian children. Here, the systematic growth of the influence of the capitalist classes in the state administration. There, an equally steady decline in proletarian influence. Here, neo-capitalist progress in every corner of Russian society. There, the unstoppable retreat of the working class across the board. Thus, the Bolshevik Party of Russia, and with it the Comintern, which it inspired spiritually, has been unmistakably in a permanent crisis since the introduction of the NEP. It has gone from being a pioneer of the proletarian world revolution to being the bearer of capitalist development! The Marxist thesis that Friedrich Engels formulated in his German Peasants' War as follows has been fulfilled in the Russian Bolsheviks. Quote, "The worst thing that can happen to a leader of an extreme party is if he is forced to take over the government at a time when the movement is not yet ripe for the rule of the class he represents and the implementation of the measures that the rule of this class requires. What the leader of an extreme party can do does not depend on the leader of the extreme party's will, but on the level to which the antagonism between the various classes has been carried, and on the degree of development of the material conditions of existence, of production, and trade relations, on which the current degree of development of the class antagonisms is based. What he should do, what his own party demands of him, does not depend on him, nor on the degree of development of the class struggle and its conditions. He is bound by his previous doctrines and demands, which do not arise from the momentary position of the social classes in relation to one another, and from the momentary, more or less accidental state of the production and trade relations, but from his greater or lesser insight into the general results of the social and political movement. He therefore necessarily finds himself in an insoluble dilemma. What he can do contradicts his entire previous behavior, his principles, and the immediate interests of his party, and what he should do cannot be carried out. In a word, he is compelled to represent not his party, his class, but the class for whose rule the movement is just ripe. In the interest of the movement itself, he must promote the interests of a class that is alien to him, and dismiss his own class with phrases and promises with the assurance that the interests of that alien class are its own interests. Anyone who gets into this distorted position is irretrievably lost." End quote. Lenin. New section. Russian foreign policy. Quote, "And now the Bolsheviks are threatened with the most terrible thing as the final destination of their thorny path. Like an eerie ghost, an alliance between the Bolsheviks and Germany is approaching!" This would indeed be the last link in the fatal chain of that the world war has wrapped around the neck of the Russian Revolution. First retreat, then capitulation, and finally an alliance with German imperialism. The Russian Revolution would thus have been hurled by the World War, which it wanted to avoid at all costs, only to the opposite pole, from the side of the Entente under the Tsar to the side of Germany under the Bolsheviks. An alliance between the Bolsheviks and German imperialism would be the most terrible moral blow that could still be dealt to international socialism. Russia was the only last corner where revolutionary socialism, purity of principles, and ideal good still had a course, where the eyes of all honest socialist elements in Germany and throughout Europe were directed in order to recover from the disgust that the practice of the West European workers' movement had inspired, to arm oneself with courage to endure, with faith in ideal works, in holy words, with the grotesque, quote, pairing, end quote, between Lenin and Hindenburg, the moral light of light in the East would be extinguished, ... Socialist revolution sitting on German bayonets, proletarian dictatorship under the aegis of German imperialism, that would be the most monstrous thing we could still experience. And on top of that, it would be pure utopia, ... Only then would old sacrifices, the great sacrifice of the Brest peace, have been made in vain, for their purchase price would ultimately be moral bankruptcy. Any political downfall of the Bolsheviks in an honest struggle against the superior power, an unfavorable historical situation, would be preferable to this moral downfall. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg in September 1918. See the Spartacus letters, pages 183 to 185, Berlin, 1920. I think this was published by Paul Levy, who, as we saw earlier, was part of the people who expelled the KAPD. I have a piece coming up on the channel, and I don't know when maybe it'll be up before this one. But it's by Paul Levy, and it's about the Russian question and about Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution. So, continuing on, quote, "There is no fundamental difference here between a loan and a military alliance, and I maintain that we have already grown to the point where we can conclude a military alliance with another bourgeoisie in order to crush another bourgeoisie by means of this bourgeois state. What will happen later under certain balances of forces, you can easily imagine. This is a question of purely strategic and tactical expediency. This is how it should be set out in the program. With this form of national defense, the military alliance with bourgeois states, it is the duty of the comrades of such a country to help this bloc to victory." End quote. Bukharin at the Fourth World Congress of the Comintern, November 1922. Russia's foreign policy must necessarily correspond to the NEP, that is, to the capitalist-oriented domestic policy. For the fatal situation which in 1921 imperatively required a change of economic course, also required the establishment of a new and fundamentally different relationship between Russia and the capitalist environment, and this is all the more urgent because Russia, stuck in the bourgeois revolution, is a tottering colossus on feet of clay in its global political isolation. Faced with the question of consolidating social conditions, the wealthy Russian peasant masses cannot solve this life's task by themselves, but only in alliance with the international bourgeoisie. So what is the soul of this foreign policy which corresponds to the NEP? In order to be able to build up its economy, the Russia of the NEP must be reintegrated into the capitalist world economic machinery. It needs machines to perfect its industry and land management. It needs markets for its agricultural products. It needs trade relations and loans. The Russia of the NEP needs peace with the capitalist world. The Russia of the NEP also needs political alliances with bourgeois states, and not proletarian world revolution, not communist revolution in the capitalist countries. The material assistance of foreign capital groups in building the NEP economy. This is the historical guideline of Russian foreign policy, which arises from the class interest of the propertied sections of society. But the foreign policy of the new economic policy, Russia, would be incomplete if it were limited to purely political and economic relations. The logic of NEP capitalist development inevitably means that Russia will also strive for military alliances in order to strengthen its position of power in the capitalist world. However, Russia can only achieve this more favorable position by trying to establish an alliance with those countries that are in a similar economic situation, not yet highly developed industrially, such as China, and with those states that, as a result of their military inferiority in the World War, have become dependent on the imperialist powers, such as Germany, Turkey, etc. Due to its weakened economic and global political position, the foreign policy of the Russian peasant state, if it is to have any real value for the new economic policy, must be aimed at paralyzing the imperialist predominance of the Geneva League of Nations under French and English leadership as far as possible by creating an Eastern League of Nations. In order to achieve this goal, Russia, and with it the Comintern, actively support the Canton government, the Kuomintang, or the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, of the Chinese landowners and capitalists in their war for national independence. For the same reason, the Moscow government supplied weapons to the national capitalists of Turkey in the Greco-Turkish War. It should be noted at the same time, Lauren Goldner has a really excellent essay about this period, which has something in the title is like Socialism in One Country Before Stalin, the origins or something like that of reactionary anti-imperialism. And I think one of the things is the Bolsheviks were entering into positive relations with Turkey as Turkey was putting down its own leftist, the own communists. And the same can be said of, although this is less clear now, but this comes to especially appear obvious that the Kuomintang is a reactionary anti-imperialist force when it slaughters the radical left in Shanghai in 1927. Anyway, the Russian government's expressions of solidarity with the English miners' strike and the temporary, quote, good relations, end quote, between, quote, Soviet Russia and Mussolini's Italy were also in line with the fight against capitalist rivals. And for the same reason, Russia also supported the Ruhr War of the German bourgeoisie through a military alliance that practically existed even at the end of 1926. The brotherhood in arms with bourgeois states is only the crowning glory of Russian foreign policy. Because for the Russia of the NEP, there can simply be no difference in principle between a loan and a military alliance. Military alliances with bourgeois states for the purpose of overthrowing another, i.e., quote, Western-oriented, end quote, and bourgeoisie, are indeed a vital necessity for Russia today. But this alliance policy simultaneously ruthlessly tears the last revolutionary veil from the face of the Russian Bolsheviks and thus completes the Russian tragedy. If Russia maintains a military alliance with a bourgeois state, then according to Bukharin, the Comintern section, i.e. the proletarians, of that country, is obliged in the event of war to, quote, help this bloc to victory, end quote, because it is a, quote, national liberation struggle, end quote, a, quote, progressive, end quote, war. However, this Leninist explanation, which forms the ideological cornerstone of Russian foreign policy, has no viable material basis in the harsh reality. It is sheer nonsense to speak of, quote, progressive wars by bourgeois states in the monopolistic phase of world capitalism. The revolutionary Marxism defines the character of wars and its attitudes to them from the standpoints of the interest of social development, and hence from the standpoint of the interest of the proletariat. Marxism divides wars into progressive and reactionary, not according to whether they are defensive or offensive, i.e. imperialist wars, whether they are for national independence or not. For Marxism, wars are progressive or reactionary depending on whether they contribute to the overthrow of the old social order that has become an obstacle to development and thus to the preparation of a new order or not. This means the only possible progressive war in the present era of a highly developed capitalism is the war against capitalism in general. From this Marxist standpoint, Turkey's war was not a progressive war because it was only about national independence. The struggle of the young Chinese bourgeoisie, which only wants greater independence from the capitalist world powers, has the same character. The clearest example, however, is the Ruhr War of 1923, which was supported by Russia. This is referring to the occupation of the Ruhr. Just to read the introduction to that Wikipedia real quick. The occupation of the Ruhr was a period from the 11th of January to 1923 to the 25th of August 1925, when French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr region of the Weimar Republic, Germany. The occupation of heavily industrialized Ruhr district. The occupation of the heavily industrialized Ruhr district came in response to Germany's repeated defaults on the reparations payments required under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The French and Belgians intended to force Germany to supply the coal and other raw materials that were part of the reparations. With the active support of the German government, civilians in the area engaged in passive resistance and civil disobedience, which largely shut down the economy of the region. Acts of sabotage and retaliation took place as well. An estimated 137 civilians were killed and 600 injured during the occupation. The ongoing economic crisis in Germany worsened considerably as a result of the occupation. The government paid for its support of idled workers and businesses primarily by printing paper money. This contributed to the hyperinflation that brought major hardships to Germans across the country. After Germany successfully stabilized its currency in late 1923, France and Belgium, facing economic and international pressures of their own, accepted the 1924 Dawes Plan drawn up by an international team of experts. The Dawes Plan restructured and lowered Germany's war reparations payments and led to France and Belgium withdrawing their troops from the Ruhr by August 1925. The occupation of the Ruhr contributed to the growth of radical right-wing movements in Germany. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party used the occupation as part of their justification for the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, which brought the Nazi Party wide public attention for the first time. Back to the text. This quote, and this is in reference to the Ruhr, this quote, national liberation struggle, end quote, of the German bourgeoisie was not progressive either, because this quote, national liberation struggle, end quote, of the German bourgeoisie's aim was not to change the social order, but only to reinstate German police and military authority. Talking about some of the, if you're curious, I have a piece on here by a researcher on anti-Semitism and the left. He actually put out a book about usually like left communists, and I suppose within the Communist Party itself, but left communists, left communists and anarchist critiques of the Communist Party of Germany in the Weimar period, about its flirtations with anti-Semitic and especially nationalist rhetoric in this period. The German Communist Party definitely, I believe at least, I would say I'd know, but then I'd feel like a jackass if it was pretty pro this also in favor of this so-called national liberation struggle as well. But he wrote an article about the effect about anti-Semitism in the German Communist Party and some of its propaganda, and a big part of it was in relation to the occupation of the Ruhr. Anyway, back to the text. The attitude of the Russian Leninist leaders towards the wars in the current high capitalist epoch now has important political consequences. In the Ruhr of 1923, Russia supported the German capitalist class through a military alliance, i.e. by supplying munitions, The KPD was therefore obliged to help this bloc to victory. And therefore had to lead the proletariat into a truce with the bourgeoisie. A few years earlier, during the World War, the German workers, according to Lenin's own statements, had the task of waging civil war. Quote, the revolutionary actions during the war, end quote, writes Lenin in, quote, Against the Current. Page 105, quote, against one's own government, certainly, and undoubtedly mean not only the desire for your government's defeat, but also an actual promotion of such a defeat, end quote. Leninism thus moves in the following contradictory cycle. During an imperialist war, the proletariat must be for the defeat of the proletariat's own country, but when this country is defeated, then it must be for the support of, quote, its bourgeoisie in its struggle for national independence, and when the, quote, subjugated bourgeoisie has once again become the representative of an equal nation through this proletarian help, the working class must again reject national defense in order to be for the defeat of its own bourgeoisie. Is there again, etc. Exclamation point. In fact, this means Leninism calls on the proletariat to renounce civil war against the bourgeoisie in the, quote, progressive national liberation struggles, end quote, and thus the only progressive war against capitalism today, exclamation point. In response to these social patriotic effects of the Leninist slogans, revolutionary Marxism calls on the workers of the highly capitalist countries. You can only exploit the national movements in the interest of social progress if you ruthlessly lay the axe to the roots of capitalism, which has become an obstacle to social development, exclamation point. Not truce, but civil war, proletariat mass actions with communist aims, is the revolutionary slogan put on the agenda by history, exclamation point. The most monstrous thing has happened. The moral light of the world proletariat in Eastern Europe has been extinguished. The Russian Bolsheviks have morally perished, ... In the 10 years after the October Revolution, the class-conscious workers of all countries, no matter how many cherished illusions may go to hell, must recognize the iron fact. The path of the Russia of the NEP, that is, the path of Leninism, leads to the defense of capitalist fatherlands by proletarians who have no fatherland, and thus to the social democratic crime of August 4th, 1914. It leads to the supply of the German Reichswehr with, quote, Soviet ammunition. The path of Leninism leads from revolution to counter-revolution. New section. Leninism for the defense of capitalist fatherlands. On January 8, 1927, at the Moscow Provincial Conference of the Bolsheviks, according to In Procure number 11 of January 25, 1927, page 203, Bukharin said the following, quote, You all know very well that Germany at that time, parenthesis, 1919 to 1923, end parenthesis, embodied the most peaceful tendency towards us, and the fact that Germany was temporarily subjected to national subjugation, humiliation, and direct plunder by the imperialist states played an enormous role. I would also like to mention here that, precisely in view of Germany's special situation, both our party and all other communist parties quite rightly consider it possible to defend even bourgeois Germany against the rapes of the imperialist states, ... If at present some politicians in bourgeois Germany, their social democratic mouthpieces and ultra-left renegades, parenthesis, question mark, end parenthesis, of communism, are trying to portray our attitude on this question as a kind of original sin and vices on our part, we can explain to them once again from this platform that the Communist Party of our country and the Soviet state led by the Communist Party will always and everywhere stand on the side of all oppressed, subjugated, and even national bourgeois states in those cases, in which they are attacked from all sides by the imperialist robbers. That is our line. We have followed this line, and we will follow it if such cases arise in the future, end quote. New section. Russia, that quote, end quote, Bukharin. New section. Russia arms the bourgeoisie. At a district party conference of the KPD, Wasser Kanta, Arthur Evert, member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany, made the following confession, according to the report in the, quote, Hamburger Volkszeitung of March 1st, 1927. Quote, Now a word about the Soviet grenades. Comrades, let us take the Turkish government, for example. It waged a war against Greece, and the Turkish government was also supplied with weapons by Soviet Russia, parenthesis, as was the case with Germany, end parenthesis. That is an established and undisputed fact. At the same time, however, the same Turkish government persecuted the communists in Turkey with the utmost severity, and that is also an undisputed fact. Our party in Turkey worked under the most difficult conditions, but the fight against the vanguard of Western imperialism of this national Turkish government was supported by Soviet Russia. This must be made clear to the workers, end quote. And that's from Arthur Evert, member of the Central Committee of the KPD, Communist Party of Germany. And that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.